All right. Welcome everybody to the very last, the only last of the year 2022.
Last is this service.
That's what I said, of the year 2022.
Is there going to be another meeting after this?
There will be in the future. I need a little bit of a break. I usually end up spending Sunday morning before worship, a little bit Sunday afternoon, and early Monday morning getting my presentation ready, then recording, and then uploading. So I'm usually all done by about noon on Monday. I need a little bit of a break from that schedule. So we're probably looking at late January before we get started. January's got a lot going on in the church life. You don't need to know this, but you know, we have our leadership retreat, we have ordination and installation of our new elders. And there are like 3 other things that happen in January that end up consuming the staff. So we like to push stuff off until the end of January before we start something new. So we'll do that. But my biggest thing is to thank you all. You know, it's one thing to come to the first lesson and to watch it. I think we had, 140 hits on the first video. And we were down to 60 on the last, and there's that attrition, and I get it. People are busy as well. But you're here, you're there, and I appreciate you coming back week after week. I enjoy this stuff, and I hope you do too.
Any ideas for the next series?
No, haven't even thought about it. You got to be kidding me. I would like to synchronize it with whatever we're doing in worship. That enables me to kill 2 birds with 1 stone instead of using up all of my arsenal. So some of that has to do with what we're going to do for Lent, because Lent starts early this year. And so we'll know more when we know more, and I'll share more when we have it figured out. But there are a lot of pieces that have to be in place before we can say, oh, this is what we'll do for this long. We may do a short series before Lent and then do a Lenten series or something like that. I take a lot of liberties with this class just because I'm trying to be strategic as well as, to serve you the best I can. So here we go. Let's finish up then and read verses 15 through 20. And here we go. When the angels had left them and gone into heaven, the shepherds said to one another, "Let us go now to Bethlehem and see this thing that has taken place, which the Lord has made known to us." So they went with haste and found Mary and Joseph and the child lying in the manger. When they saw this, they made known what had been told them about the child. All who heard it were amazed at what the shepherds told them. But Mary treasured all these words and pondered them in her heart. The shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all they had heard and seen, as it had been told them. All right, this ends the reading. So first, any questions you have about the video, the text, anything like that? Yes, Jerome.
I hate to always be the one to start things off, but I'm curious as to what the audience is that we're speaking to as far as sending the angel. Once the angels have departed, the shepherds are the people in the know. The shepherds don't seem like a large group and don't seem to be the ones to spread the word of all they had seen and heard. It just seems like you picked a group that's not going to do much for the movement, as it were.
Yeah. So somewhere around Acts chapter 1 or 2, somewhere along that line, Luke learned how to count. And boy, did he start counting. He tell you how many people were here and there, how many people were saved, how many people were this and that. He doesn't really do a lot of counting here. And I think Jerome, therefore, it's left to our speculation. I mean, that's all it can be, is to what these numbers are. He does give us the shepherds, it's plural, from 2 to 6,000, right? One can't imagine. I mean, I don't know shepherding practices. I don't know how large this flock is. I have no idea if this is a coalition of shepherds. This is 3 guys. We don't know. So we have to imagine that. And then they're telling them, I try to point out in the video that our translation leaves out, I think, a key word that says they're spreading it around, they're spreading it abroad. So they're talking to more than just Mary and Joseph and kind of telling them their fantastic story. But again, no number connected to it, right? So now we have to speculate, well, if you had lots of people moving because of the census, right? They all had to go to their family's home of origin to be registered. That's what brings Joseph and family to Bethlehem. That may have brought a lot of people, given that there's no room in the inn. So we can speculate that there's probably a lot of folks relatively kin to one another, distantly perhaps, share the same faith, may have gathered, having heard there's a baby being born. I mean, that's what I would do, right? If we were all suddenly resettled into a camp and there's a baby being born over in that corner, I'd probably go and make sure everything's fine and enjoy the occasion. So I don't know. You asked, I think, 2 different questions. One was, who's the audience that Luke is writing to? That's kind of a separate question over here. And then, who's the audience the shepherds are talking to? And one of the lovely things about this story is that it's so sparse in its details that we get to imagine it in a way that's powerful and meaningful. We just can't imagine it in a way that's definite and arguable, right? We just have to acknowledge that it's our sense of things. Now, as far as to whom Luke is writing, I'm going to say this for the last time. I want to say, I promise you'll never hear this from me again, but that's probably not true. Remember, Luke is very open about finding sources who are firsthand sources, if possible. At least sources who can trace their stories back to those who were witnesses. And my suspicion is that the sources for the story of Jesus are a little different than the sources for the birth story of John the Baptizer. And so we've got a couple layers here. On the one hand, you've got these sources that Luke is drawing from. We don't know who they are, but we know that his intent was to trace back to the original witnesses as closely as possible. And then we have Luke, who's processing all these things. And then we have the audience to whom Luke is writing, ostensibly Theophilus, right? Remember those first 4 verses? I'm writing to you, Theophilus. But we know that name means lover of God or friend of God. So ostensibly it could be you, right? It could be anybody who's a friend of God or lover of God. We get the sense that Luke is not writing to a Jewish audience. We get the sense that Luke explains things that might be unfamiliar to people not living in the Israel-Palestinian region. Luke himself seems to be very well educated, urbane, and all those things. The way I think about it, and I don't know if this is true, but the way I think about it is I read Luke and then I read Acts, the book of Acts, and you see how the gospel went from being mostly Jerusalem-based to spreading out, just like, Jesus kind of told the disciples it should flow. And even to the Roman Empire itself, into Rome. So my suspicion is you've got this large contingent of relatively new followers of the Christ who, to whom Luke is trying to give a definitive story. And it's not a biography, it's a gospel. So he's giving a definitive story of what it means to call Jesus the Christ. Not every little detail about the life of Jesus. That's different. And my suspicion is that the greater audience are these Gentile Christians, maybe not entirely familiar with the topography and geography of Israel, Palestine. And Luke is not nearly as attentive to the Old Testament prophecies as Matthew is in telling. That's why we think that Matthew's writing to a Jewish audience and Luke is writing to a Gentile audience. Something like that. I hope that danced around your question the best I can. Yeah. All right, great, thanks. Any other reactions to the reading or the video or anything?
Just a comment that I really liked your explanation of the word and reality. Yeah, that was really interesting.
That just really struck me throughout this text particularly, but it is a common thread throughout the scriptures. Yeah, and you know that's why I think lying is such a horrible sin.
Yeah.
It just dishonors the connection between word and reality. And intentional lying, not someone who's misled and carries it on. But maybe that helps us realize why gossip and things like that are so, that especially in the New Testament, they pay attention to that. Because once that connection between word and reality is disrupted, that disrupts community. It disrupts our whole basis for trust. And so at least 2 of the 10 commandments have to do with words not matching reality. One is taking the name of God in vain, and one is bearing false witness. And that shows how important that is. So yeah, thank you. I think in this story, we see it mostly through what's seen and heard. And it's interesting to think about whether we are more of a visual culture or an audio culture, or whether you are more of a visual learner or an audio learner. You know, I'm sure Jen and those of you who have been involved in either counseling or education can say loads more about this than I can. But that's a real difference. It's a different way of approaching and apprehending reality. I think in the scriptures, the idea is that the hearing is connected to this rhema, this word spoken, or the logos, the word written, and seeing is related to verifying and validating, experiencing for oneself. And the full comprehension lies in both, something like that. I think it's really profound, the epistemology that's going on in this story with those terms. Okay, sorry, you just make simple statements and I just prattle. But I'm just, this is the end. Okay, any other questions, comments? Anything from the chat there, Jen?
Nope.
All right, then what I want to do is just step back and see what we've done together here and just kind of walk through again where we started and where we ended up. I'm going to skip the first four verses, but you remember that in those first 4 verses, Luke introduces his gospel. I love it. I think those first 4 verses, you should be very, very familiar with that. And you should continually go back to that. Because I think the best way to read the scriptures is to try to read them in the way that they were written. And you get some real disclosure here of at least what Luke thinks he's doing. He's telling you. And now I get to say, oh, wow, I'm reading someone who worked real hard, who, however much I might claim he was inspired by the Holy Spirit in what he's doing, he doesn't make that claim for himself. He tells us he did his homework and he's trying to get as close to the original sources as possible. That's really cool. So that's how Luke's gospel starts. But then we get the story, right? And the story is a weaving of the story of John the Baptist and Jesus. So we want to honor that. That's what's happening throughout the first chapter and the very beginning of the second chapter. It's woven in a way to show that they are both incredible stories, and God is behind them, right? This is very high honor for John the Baptist. His birth was an unlikely birth, very much like Isaac's, which if you're Jewish, that means a lot. Very much like Samuel's, which if you're Jewish, that means a lot, right? So John the Baptist is heralded, but the story, as well as it's told, keeps being subordinated to the next story, which is the story of the Christ. So it's really clever how Luke weaves them, honors John, but subordinates John. So what happens first is the birth announcement of John. Secondly, the birth announcement of Jesus. The birth of John, then the birth of Jesus. That's the general way that the flow happens. And then in between all of that, I try to represent what I think are kind of the touch points of the story. So just looking at that, I don't have a lot to say other than what I just filled out for you in print here. Well, what do you think about this story? What parts of it really grabbed you? And I'm curious as to maybe something that you've discovered along the way in our study together. So just look at that story and tell me what it's doing for you at this point.
What surprised me, the thing that really stuck with me about this was Mary's song. Having grown up Catholic, and Mary is deified. She's more like the Uber mother. But in this, she's not that at all. She's almost fierce.
Yeah.
And I was really surprised by that, and I really, what's the word I want? I was taken with that, and I surprised.
Yeah. Okay. Jan, ask the people on Zoom if they heard that comment. If not, I can repeat it. Okay.
Oh, Betty says yes.
Yes?
Yes,
Okay.
and Bill has not responded.
Yeah. So that Magnificat is magnificent, isn't it? You know. Yeah. So for me, what it makes me do, it makes me really aware of how Mary is depicted. Visually, musically, and all that. Do they pick up on the fierceness? I think that's just a marvelous adjective to describe what she's doing. You know, I've heard her described as kind of mousy, but she's a mouse that roars, right? And part of it is, do you focus on the Magnificat to kind of see what she's made of, or do you usually, in kind of pious circles, it's that moment when she says, you know, here I am, servant of the Lord, let it be to me according to your will. And in that sense, she just sounds very submissive. That becomes the key adjective. But boy, when you read the Magnificat, she's like, oh, I'm part of something that's really going to change everything, right? And she's all in. She's real excited about this. So that's cool. Yes, sir.
You talk about the interweaving of John and Jesus. There's also a sub-weaving of Elizabeth and Mary
Sure.
that gets overlooked very easily.
Yeah, and that's part of the subtext of the John and Jesus story is Elizabeth and Mary. And, you know, again, Elizabeth is a symbolic representative figure. She is Sarah. She is Hannah. She is she stands in line of a very revered symbol of women who have been barren all of their lives and who God blesses later in life, with a child. With Mary, hers is unique, right? I don't know of any other virgin birth story in the Old Testament. So she's not really standing in the tradition of the barren women. Hers is a unique story. And in that sense, again, I think kind of elevates her story a little bit over Elizabeth, but they are very much intertwined. So I've had a couple of people, and we mentioned this in passing earlier, a couple of people asking about how old Elizabeth might be. And I don't know who the source is, but a number of folks had read that, she could be at the astounding ripe old age of 30, 28, something like that. Because, Mary could very likely be 14, 13, right? So as soon as a young girl came into her capacity to be impregnated, they were often married. And so they were married very young. Now, again, Luke doesn't do numbers for us. So it's all speculation that Mary could be 13, 14, Joseph could be 30, 35. And that feels a little gross, but it's a whole different context that we're talking about here. At no point does Mary use the word gross in either Luke or Matthew. So, whatever. So the idea is that, once you hit your mid to late 20s, you kind of past your prime and you're considered barren. But there's a phrase that Luke uses to describe Zechariah and Elizabeth as having gotten on in their days. I think that's kind of the literal translation. They've gotten on in their days. And he uses that phrase one more time in the second chapter with a woman named Anna, who's in the temple. Now, he will add an adjective, very, very on in her days, very, it kind of, so it might be a little more extreme for Anna's case. But here, Luke does give us a number. She's 84 years old. So we got to get it out of our head that everybody was dead by 50, right? That lifespan was so short. You have to be fertile between 13 and 24, and because then you're going down. There are 84-year-olds. Simeon is depicted as an older person.
Methuselah.
Well, Methuselah is a different story altogether. That's ridiculous stuff there. So there's nobody in the birth story 969 years old. You can be sure of that. So Luke doesn't assume that the phrase getting on in one's days means 28. It sounds like he's actually talking about somebody who's lived a fairly long lifespan. I don't know that Elizabeth, therefore, is 84, like Anna, but it's similar terminology that he uses. So whoever the scholar is that's saying, oh, she's probably 28 years old, I think that's shaky. I don't think that's good scholarship. I'd have to go back to the original source and read the argument for it. But on the face of it, I think that person needs to read the second chapter and to see how Luke describes Anna and then enumerates her years. So I'm just not really warm to that argument. That's just me. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I appreciate the outline that you've done on the back, and it points out some interesting things to me. We start out in the temple in Jerusalem, right?
Yeah.
A major place.
Yes.
We end up in a stable, in a little old nondescript town, right? Where a woman 9 months pregnant has ridden miles on the back of a donkey.
Maybe. Luke doesn't talk about transportation either, no matter what. that whole way.
Well, it wasn't an airplane, you know that, right? You know, there's almost, I wonder if there's an intentional contrast there, and, you know, all of a sudden we have this decree and the travel and the no room at the inn, and
Right.
yeah, it's,
Yeah,
he's
so
telling
let's think about
he's
location.
arranging the story in kind of an interesting way that kind of points up those differences.
Right. So taking the story together, it starts in the temple. It actually ends in the temple. Because what we haven't read is the rest of chapter 2. They take Jesus to the temple. And that's where Simeon and Anna and all these folks are. But if my speculation that none of you has said, oh, pop, if this is correct, if the story of John is a story that comes from the John the Baptizer community, then John's story starts in the temple and ends in the wilderness. I think that's huge. And I think that's exactly how his community would tell the story, is that the Spirit, they're validating the temple, but subordinating it to what's happening in the wilderness. So what's the difference there? Well, the temple economy, the temple hierarchy, the temple process, the temple system, we would call it today, is very much enmeshed in the imperial system of the Roman Empire. And this is why Jesus is in constant tension with the temple leadership. They're not saying that God's not there, but they are saying that that's not where God is really doing a great thing. It's happening here in the wilderness. You see, that's what the John the Baptizer folks would say. You got to leave the system and live outside the grid in order to be faithful to what God is doing right now. And John is often considered an ascetic for living in the wilderness and not wearing the nice clothes that came out of the textile industry, but wearing, you know, animal skins and so forth. So John is in some way really, his piety is grounded in being off the grid, in more like a hermit or a hermitage society or something like that. So the John stories, I think, move from temple to wilderness. I think that's really interesting. The Jesus story moves from Nazareth to the temple, but then they're going to leave and go back home, right? So they'll end up back in Nazareth. So the folks telling the Jesus story aren't making that argument that the folks telling the John story are with geography. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If we're going back to the sources and we're skating on thin ice here, we're making a lot of guesses just based on what we're reading. But it sure seems like that source for John's story feels like the temple is no longer where God's presence is most strongly identified. The desert, the wilderness is, which means they read Isaiah. A voice cries out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, right? They're very dedicated to that. Read the descriptions of Elijah. He lived off the grid. When he came into town, it scared the snot out of everybody because he usually didn't come saying, you know, you're doing great. But then the folks telling Jesus' story don't seem to have that argument going. I don't say they have a counter argument. I just don't think that's for them as important to point out. Jesus will occasionally go out to the desert, to the wilderness for the temptations, for the transfiguration, to pray. But he's not a wilderness figure. He's a small town Galilean figure. Yeah. Kind of interesting, but it's sacred geography, right? Like you ask yourself, where is God found most powerfully today? A lot of folks will tell you, well, it's not in the USA. Because most of our churches are shrinking and most of our influence is becoming capitulating to capitalism and, power games and stuff. And I think a daring church analyst would tell you probably in the Pentecostal movements of Latin America and Africa. That's where you really start to see, energy, as it were. That's not to say God isn't in America or isn't in a mainline church or even this church. I believe God is, and very powerfully so. But I think in terms of just trying to measure the esprit, the spirit of the time, I think we have to get off of our high horse. It's not European American denominations that are stellar examples of what God is up to right now. Many of us are wondering about our own institutional survival.
Well, European churches have turned into museums.
Museums, yes, and you go there. They hatch, match, and dispatch, right? They baptize, they marry, and they bury, and in between, like you just roll your eyes at church.
Well, from my perspective, one time, every campus had a Westminster house, and one of the things they did was provide housing. Now you don't find any, quote, religious activities, but you find dormitories.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you can see the trend in a number of ways. Even like some colleges that were started with a church affiliation became much more secularized or more ecumenical. The second of which I think is a good thing. But I would say in the last 10 years, there's been a lot of those schools have tried to reconnect themselves with their Christian origins. So it's kind of a pendulum swing in some respects. But you're right. I mean, the Presbyterian Church was once huge and wealthy and influential and, well represented in Congress and all those things. And we had the money to do that. And it was a good thing to do. But that's not the context now. Yes, sir.
Listening to this series, it seems to me that maybe written on the wall of Luke's study, beginning with this part all the way through Acts, was a deliberate intent to move out worldwide. Like this is a motivating spur.
Right. Yeah. All right, now I'm going to tell you things about me you don't want to know. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I'm not convinced that Luke wrote Acts. I'm not convinced that the same person who wrote Luke wrote Acts. I do think that whoever wrote Acts was either a companion or disciple of Luke. There is a continuity, an intentional continuity, it seems to me. But there also seem to me to be some kind of interesting differences. And I think women are much more empowered in Luke's gospel than they are in the book of Acts. We have a couple of women in Acts that play significant roles, but they come and they leave, and they don't really play a lasting role. I think Jesus seemed a little more radical in Luke than Jesus is presented in the book of Acts. And for those of you that were part of our study of Paul's letters, we studied the book called The First Paul. And it's written by John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg. And they made an argument that I was so happy to run across because it really answered a lot of the troubling questions I had had for many, many years and suspicions I had. So I like people that confirm my suspicion. They argued that of the 13 letters in the New Testament attributed to Paul, he really wrote 6 of them. And, you know, that's not to say the other people writing the other letters were doing some nefarious sleight of hand. One would often write in the name of someone else, if that name was known, right? There's a whole process of being the amanuensis for somebody, the one who writes for them. Sometimes you get to speak on their behalf. You know, Caesar didn't write all the things that have Caesar's name on it, right? Because there were people writing on behalf of Caesar. And sometimes with Caesar's approval, sometimes in the spirit of Caesar, without Caesar's attachment at all. All right. So in some letters of Paul, you have this radical vision that the reign of God means that in Christ there's no male or female, Jew or Greek. You know, all those differences are overcome in Christ. And then in some letters attributed to Paul, you have women ought to be silent in the church. It's wrong for a woman to exercise authority over a man. All of the reasons that women weren't ordained for many years. And you hold them side by side and you think, well, you know, how can one person, you know, be so different? And what Borg and Crossan argued is that there was Paul who had a radical theology that over time, that theology just would not allow the Christian church to either survive or grow in certain contexts. And so these people writing these other letters are just trying to soften the edges a little bit. And so they call that the conservatizing Paul, right? Someone who's the companion of Paul, knows Paul's theology, but is trying to make Paul's gospel a little less radical for a certain context. And we can look at that snidely, or we could say, you know, that's just sometimes what you have to do, right? You have to kind of tone it down a little bit so you don't alienate people right off the bat. And then there are some letters that they call the reactionary Paul. This would be like 1st, 2nd, Timothy, Titus. These are, and scholars will tell you these are much later letters than 1st Thessalonians. That's probably the earliest writing we have in the New Testament. So thinking about that, I have a suspicion that there's kind of the same relationship between Luke and Acts. That someone very Lucan is trying to continue the story. It may be someone who was a companion of Paul's for a time, because there is a small segment at chapter 16, maybe 17, 18, a couple of times where the language switches from the 3rd person, either Paul or they, to the 1st person plural, we. So you have the feeling that whoever's writing was companioning this journey for a time. And I suspect it's a different person, but a well-intended person who's trying to extend the program, but maybe just didn't have quite Luke's broad vision. Or rather, the broadness of Acts is a little different than the broadness of Luke. It's not gender inclusivity. It's not the poor and the rich. It's not, you know, the economic overturning, all of that stuff that you hear in the Magnificat or Jesus' first sermon, those things in Luke. But it's more like the gospel spreads and just finds its place in what they considered the world at that time, which is a lovely vision. And I love the book of Acts, but I think it's a little different than Paul, than Luke, rather. So So I like what you're saying. And I think when you look at Luke and Acts together, I still think they're companion volumes. I think it's worthwhile looking at them together. Whoever wrote Acts intended it to be volume 2 of the Gospel of Luke. And it may well be Luke, and I could be entirely off my rocker. Don't trust me on this. This is just me confessing my suspicions here. But the flow clearly is from Jerusalem to all of Judea and Samaria and Galilee and to the rest of the world. That's what you see in the Great Commission. That's in the last chapter of Luke, as well as the first chapter of Acts, stated differently. But the whole idea is that this is no longer going to be simply a faith that's centered around Galilee or Jerusalem. It's going to be global. And that's where the book of Acts really takes us in some very fascinating, wonderful ways. Maybe that should be our next study. Anyway, that's my heresy of the day. I always try to have at least one.
Sneak one in there.
What's that?
You sneak one in there.
I always sneak one in. Anyway. Anybody besides men have something to ask or say about what we've been looking at here? Sorry, guys. You told me before you want to make more room. Anybody else have any interest, question, concern?
Goodbye.
Yeah. Well, Merry Christmas. All right, I don't have any more riffing to do.
I have sort of a like half-baked thing I'm thinking about, so it's like not a great idea. But it was about like where is their freedom and where is their compulsion in this story? Like where Zechariah is forced to like muteness, but like Mary gets to like elect to like share stuff out loud, and then being moved for the decree and travel and that forced movement there, and then where within there is choice. So like it's not a really good thing, but it's just sort of something I'm looking at.
Yeah, that's a great approach to the story. And in some respects, I mean, you could name it this, the dynamic between freedom and destiny.
Yeah.
Right? If you think of destiny not as something written in the stars, but simply the thing we have to do that's not really our choice. We're led to it either divinely or imperially, right? Yeah, that's an interesting intersection between people making choices and people putting up with situations, conditions, right? Yeah, that's a great approach to any biblical story, I think. As long as you're not saying things, I'll keep talking. I think that really comes to fore in the scripture that you read and preached on for your committee last week. So let me announce that last week in the sanctuary, Jen preached a sermon in front of the Committee on Preparation for Ministry in the Presbytery of Los Ranchos. And Shane and Hayes and Dick Allen, her liaison from our elders, and me. And they discussed the sermon, they discussed her faith statement, and they declared her ready for a call. So this was the last hurdle she has to take. The only thing left for Jen to be ordained is to get a call. And so she's in the process of putting together her personal information form, taking a deep breath. She's going to be stepping down from her role here. We've known that was coming. I dread that day. And we're anxious about what lies in the future. So the scripture she read was from Mark, and it was about a man with an unclean spirit. And I think those stories are really, really sharply intertwined stories of freedom and destiny, right? Look at the way Jesus talks to somebody with an unclean spirit, or you've got a person. And if you think about the whole person, this whole person's experience, the unclean spirit is part of it. But you also want to say, this person is not reduced to the unclean spirit. They can be liberated from that and be whole again, right? And it's really an interesting New Testament phenomenon. It happens in almost all the synoptic gospels anyway, that they refuse to reduce somebody to their affliction or their possession or something like that. But they also refuse not to recognize how that's part of that person's identity. So that freedom destiny thing, it plays out throughout all these scriptural stories, and it's not a bad lens to bring to every story. Where is somebody free here, and where are things beyond their control, whether it's God at work in their life or evil at work in their life? Where is that tension between freedom and destiny? My favorite theologian, Paul Tillich, actually said freedom and destiny is one of the lenses through which you have to look at life, period. And I think that's true. Thanks, Jen.
Yeah.
And congratulations.
Thank
All right. Anything else? All right, y'all are ready for your Christmas break. I can see it. Kids looking at the clock thinking, if we can get out early tonight, we can start early.
We just like to listen to you talk.
Well, bless your heart. That's all I can say. And you know what I mean by that. Yeah. Well, thank you. I feel like I've talked out now at this point. So let's call it. Sue Ann, you can stop the recording if you wish. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for hanging with it. This has been wonderful. And we'll start it back at the end of January. Okay? Okay. Thank you.
Feel like it's